I was standing by the champagne fountain at the Meridian Industries annual gala, watching my husband Daniel laugh at something his boss had whispered in his ear, when I realized they were both staring directly at me. Victoria Cross, the VP of Operations who'd made Daniel's life miserable for 3 years, had her manicured hand on his shoulder and was speaking just loud enough for me to catch fragments over the orchestra music. Something about community college degrees and knowing your place. Daniel's laugh was the worst part, high and nervous, the sound he made when he was trying to impress someone at my expense. I stood there in my thrift store evening gown that I'd spent 2 weeks altering to fit properly, holding a glass of wine I couldn't afford to replace if I spilled it, and felt something cold settle in my chest as I watched my husband of 7 years choose his career over my dignity. "Well, at least she tries," Victoria said just loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, and Daniel nodded like he was agreeing to something reasonable instead of participating in my public humiliation. "My name is Celeste Morrison, and I spend my days teaching 7th grade mathematics at Roosevelt Middle School, where the heating system breaks down every winter and the textbooks are older than some of my students' parents. I've been there for 9 years now, ever since I finished my master's degree in education at Portland State, and I genuinely love the chaos of it, the way kids' faces light up when they finally understand fractions. The satisfaction of helping someone who thought they were bad at math discover they just needed a different approach. My classroom is on the 2nd floor with windows that face the parking lot, and I've decorated it with student artwork and motivational posters I bought with my own money. Every morning at 7:15, I unlock the door and arrange the desks in groups of 4, write the day's learning objective on the whiteboard in my careful teacher handwriting, and prepare for another day of trying to make algebra feel relevant to 13-year-olds who are more concerned with TikTok than linear equations. At home, Daniel and I live in a modest craftsman bungalow in the Woodstock neighborhood, the kind of house that needs constant maintenance we can't quite afford on 2 middle-class salaries. I spend most evenings at the kitchen table grading papers and planning lessons while Daniel works on his laptop in the living room, preparing presentations for his job as a project manager at Meridian Industries, a tech company that designs software for healthcare systems. We used to dream together about saving up for a bigger house, maybe starting a family once we felt more financially stable. Those conversations happen less frequently now, replaced by discussions about Daniel's latest work drama and whether we can afford to fix the leaky roof this year. If stories about finding your voice resonate with you, make sure you're subscribed. Some truths take time to surface. The trouble with Victoria Cross started the day she was hired as Daniel's new supervisor. Before her arrival, Daniel had been thriving at Meridian Industries, leading successful projects and earning consistent praise from upper management. He'd been there for 5 years, had built solid relationships with his team, and was being considered for a promotion to senior project manager. Victoria changed everything within her first month. She was the kind of manager who needed to establish dominance immediately, and Daniel became her primary target for reasons I never fully understood. Maybe it was because he'd been well-liked by the previous manager she'd replaced, or because his quiet competence threatened her need to be seen as indispensable. Whatever her motivation, she began systematically undermining his confidence through a campaign of small humiliations. She'd schedule important meetings during his lunch breaks, then criticize him for being unprepared when he hadn't had time to review materials. She'd reassign his most successful projects to other team members, explaining that she needed to see if he could handle more challenging work. She'd interrupt him during presentations to correct minor details, making him look incompetent in front of clients and colleagues. The worst part was watching Daniel internalize her criticism. He started working longer hours, double-checking every email before sending it, second-guessing decisions he would have made confidently before. He'd come home exhausted and anxious, convinced that maybe Victoria was right, maybe he wasn't performing at the level the company needed. When I tried to point out that her behavior seemed deliberately destructive, Daniel would defend her. "She's just demanding," he'd say. "She has high standards. The company brought her in to shake things up, and maybe I need to step up my game." The final betrayal came 6 months before the gala. Daniel had been working on a proposal for a major healthcare client, spending weeks perfecting every detail. The day before the presentation, Victoria announced that she'd be taking over, explaining that the client specifically requested senior-level involvement. Daniel's proposal was presented word for word under Victoria's name, earning praise and a significant bonus that she didn't share. The Meridian Industries Gala was supposed to be our night out together, a rare opportunity to dress up and enjoy ourselves away from the stress of work and bills. Daniel had been excited about it for weeks, talking about how important it was for him to network with upper management, how attending these events was crucial for career advancement. I'd spent my limited budget carefully, finding a navy blue evening gown at a consignment shop and taking it to my neighbor Mrs. Kim, who'd helped me alter it to fit properly. I felt beautiful walking into the grand ballroom of the Sentinel Hotel, my hair styled in an updo I'd practiced from a YouTube tutorial, wearing the pearl earrings my grandmother had left me. But the moment we arrived, I could feel the subtle shift in Daniel's behavior. He became hyper-aware of how we looked compared to the other couples, wives in designer gowns with professional styling, men in custom-tailored tuxedos. I watched him catalog the differences, saw him mentally calculating the cost of their accessories, and wondering what people would think about my obviously thrift store dress. Victoria appeared within minutes, resplendent in what was clearly $1,000 gown, her hair and makeup professionally done. She greeted Daniel with exaggerated enthusiasm, then turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Celeste," she said, drawing out my name like it was foreign on her tongue. "How lovely that you could join us. I'm sure teaching middle school doesn't provide many opportunities to attend events like this." The comment was perfectly crafted, technically polite, but designed to make me feel out of place, to remind everyone within earshot that I was the wife with the lesser job, the one who didn't quite belong at this level of corporate sophistication. What broke my heart was watching Daniel's reaction. Instead of defending me or redirecting the conversation, he laughed awkwardly and made a joke about how I was probably more comfortable in a classroom than a ballroom. It was a small moment, barely noticeable to most observers, but it felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than Victoria's calculated rudeness. That's when I realized I was completely alone in this room full of people, married to someone who had sacrificed my dignity to protect his own insecurity. I excused myself to the restroom, needing a moment to collect myself before I said something I'd regret. The ladies' lounge was all marble and soft lighting, designed to make wealthy women feel pampered while they touched up their expensive makeup. I stood at the mirror looking at my reflection. The dress I'd been so proud of suddenly felt cheap under these lights, and I could see where my amateur alteration job showed around the seams. But then I caught my own eyes in the mirror and remembered who I was underneath the insecurity. I was a woman who'd put herself through graduate school while working full-time, who'd built a classroom where kids felt safe to make mistakes and learn. I was someone who could explain complex mathematical concepts to 13-year-olds with patience and creativity, who'd helped dozens of students discover they were smarter than they'd believed. I thought about my students, especially the ones who came from families like mine, parents who worked multiple jobs, kids who wore hand-me-down clothes and sometimes came to school hungry. I thought about how I taught them to stand up straight, speak clearly, and never apologize for their circumstances. I thought about Maria Gonzalez, who'd started the year convinced she was terrible at math and was now solving algebraic equations with confidence. What kind of example was I setting by allowing these people to diminish me? What kind of teacher was I if I couldn't apply my own lessons about self-respect and dignity? I straightened my shoulders, reapplied my lipstick, and walked back into that ballroom with a different energy. I wasn't going to shrink anymore to make other people comfortable with their own cruelty. I spent the next hour observing instead of participating, using the skills I developed as a teacher to read the room and understand the real dynamics at play. Victoria wasn't just targeting me, she was working the room like a politician, carefully managing her image while subtly undermining anyone she perceived as competition. I watched her interrupt colleagues mid-sentence, saw her take credit for ideas that clearly belonged to others, noticed how she positioned herself in every important conversation while making sure Daniel stayed on the periphery. She was performing dominance for an audience that included the CEO, Marcus Fleming, who'd built Meridian Industries from a startup 10 years ago. My first instinct was to confront her directly, but I'd learned from years of classroom management that direct confrontation with a bully often backfires spectacularly. Bullies are prepared for direct attacks, they're not prepared for strategic thinking. Instead, I started listening to conversations around the bar area, paying attention to office dynamics and company gossip. That's when I overheard two senior managers discussing some confusion about project timelines and budget allocations. One mentioned that several clients had been asking pointed questions about billing discrepancies on projects Victoria had managed. I filed that information away and continued circulating, introducing myself as Daniel's wife to colleagues he'd mentioned over the years. Most were polite, but clearly more interested in networking with people who could advance their careers. But I did connect with Janet Walsh from Human Resources, who remembered me from the company picnic 2 years ago and asked thoughtful questions about my teaching work. During our conversation, Janet mentioned how challenging it had been to handle certain personnel issues lately, especially complaints that couldn't be easily documented or addressed through normal channels. She seemed frustrated by situations where company policy wasn't equipped to handle subtle forms of workplace manipulation. I made a mental note about that conversation and continued gathering information, slowly building a picture of Victoria's methods and the impact she was having beyond just Daniel's experience. By the time dinner was served, I had a much clearer understanding of the situation. The opportunity came during the after-dinner networking hour, when CEO Marcus Fleming was making his rounds through the crowd, stopping to chat with employees and their families. I'd observed him throughout the evening. He was genuine in his interactions, asked specific questions about people's work, and seemed to genuinely care about company culture. When he approached our group, Victoria immediately monopolized the conversation, launching into a detailed account of her recent successes while positioning herself as the solution to every challenge the company faced. Daniel stood quietly beside her, and I could see him shrinking as she dominated the space that should have been his moment to connect with leadership. I waited for the right moment, then stepped forward with a warm smile. "Mr. Fleming," I said, extending my hand, "I'm Celeste Morrison, Daniel's wife. I teach middle school mathematics, and I have to say, your company's approach to employee development reminds me a lot of what we try to do in education." He seemed genuinely interested, asking about my teaching methods and drawing parallels to management strategies. That's when I made my move, speaking quietly but clearly enough for the immediate group to hear. "You know," I continued, "in education we've learned that the most effective leaders are those who develop others rather than just showcasing their own abilities. I've noticed that some of Daniel's most innovative project ideas have been implemented successfully over the past year, and it speaks well of your company culture that good ideas can come from anywhere in the organization." Fleming nodded, looking thoughtful. "I'd noticed that too," he said, glancing at Daniel with new interest. "Some of those healthcare integration solutions were particularly creative." Victoria's face went pale as she realized what I'd just done. Without making any direct accusations, I'd highlighted Daniel's contributions while subtly questioning her leadership style. I'd planted a seed that would make Fleming pay attention to the actual source of innovative ideas rather than just who presented them in meetings. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Fleming asking Daniel direct questions about his project work while Victoria struggled to maintain her dominant position in the discussion. The change wasn't immediate, but it was noticeable. Within 2 weeks of the gala, Daniel mentioned that Fleming had stopped by his office to discuss some of his project proposals in detail. A month later, Daniel was invited to present directly to a major client, without Victoria's involvement. The real shift came when Human Resources announced a comprehensive review of management practices, focusing on employee development and recognition. Janet Walsh, whom I'd spoken with at the gala, was leading the initiative. During the review process, several employees came forward with concerns about Victoria's management style, and patterns began emerging that supported what I'd subtly suggested to Fleming. Victoria wasn't fired. That would have been too dramatic and potentially problematic for the company. Instead, she was transferred to a strategic planning role with no direct reports, effectively removing her from day-to-day management while allowing her to save face. Daniel was promoted to senior project manager, taking over several of her former responsibilities. The most satisfying part was watching Daniel rediscover his confidence. Without Victoria's constant undermining, he began contributing ideas freely in meetings again, building stronger relationships with clients, and remembering why he loved his work in the first place. He started coming home energized instead of defeated, talking about projects with enthusiasm instead of anxiety. At home, our relationship also shifted. Daniel began asking about my teaching work with genuine interest again, remembering details about my students and supporting my professional development in ways he'd neglected during the Victoria crisis. He seemed to recognize that he'd nearly lost something important by trying to protect his career at my expense. We still live in the same house with a leaky roof, but we're planning for that family we used to dream about. I kept thinking about that moment at the gala when I had to choose between shrinking to make others comfortable and standing up for my own worth. The decision felt small at the time, just a conversation with the CEO about education and leadership, but it changed everything. Teaching middle school has given me a unique perspective on power dynamics. 13-year-olds are experts at testing boundaries, finding weaknesses, and exploiting insecurities. The skills I use every day to maintain classroom respect while nurturing learning turned out to be exactly what I needed to handle corporate bullying. The most important lesson wasn't about revenge, it was about recognizing my own value and refusing to accept other people's diminished version of who I am. Victoria needed to make me feel small to feel powerful herself, but that was always her problem, not mine. Now when my students face bullying or feel intimidated by challenging situations, I tell them what I learned that night. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to shrink. Stand in your truth, speak with quiet confidence, and trust that authentic strength will eventually be recognized. The right people will always notice the difference between genuine competence and performed superiority.